The Man Who Sat Still. The story of Samuel Carter when a 62-year-old man was publicly questioned about belonging in first class. He didn't yell. He didn't protest. But by the time the plane landed, his calm response had gone viral, and the airline found itself scrambling for damage control. Samuel Carter didn't look like a man who needed to prove anything. 62 years old, broad-shouldered, with silver streaks threading through his close-cropped hair, and deep-set eyes that had seen far more than they would ever say. He walked through Gate C-12 at Phoenix Sky Harbor with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and felt no need to explain himself to anyone. He wore a navy linen blazer, crisp khakis, and polished leather shoes, not flashy, but enough to suggest he held himself to a quiet standard, even in retirement. In his right hand, he carried a worn, leather-bound book of Langston Hughes poetry, its edges soft from years of turning pages. It traveled with him everywhere, a reminder of where he came from and who he was. In his left, a boarding pass, Seat 2A, First Class, Flight 349 to Seattle, boarding right on schedule. This trip was simple. No business, no obligations. Just Samuel treating himself to peace, a window seat, a cold drink, and the poetry that had carried him through decades as a school principal in Savannah, Georgia. As he boarded, Samuel greeted the flight attendant at the door with a warm, "How you doing?" and a smile so genuine that it caught her slightly off guard. She smiled back, scanned his boarding pass, and gestured toward the front row. Samuel eased into his seat. The cushion felt firm, the air nozzle overhead adjustable just enough. He folded his blazer neatly over his lap, thumbed open his book to a familiar, dog-eared page, and settled in. Around him, the cabin slowly filled. Quiet conversations hummed, bags thumped into overhead bins, and the kind of half-smiles that strangers exchange floated across the rows. It was the small choreography of shared travel, and Samuel melted into it. And then came Captain Austin Remington, tall, tan, and radiating an aura of self-satisfaction. Captain Remington was the kind of man who wore sunglasses indoors and called the cabin crew kids. He strutted through first class not just like he owned the plane, but like he owned the people on it. He nodded at familiar faces, clapped a man on the shoulder with a loud laugh, and then, stopping suddenly at row 2, stared straight at Samuel. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Sir," Remington said, loud enough for several rows to hear, a tone of exaggerated courtesy dripping with something sharper underneath. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Samuel didn't blink. Calmly, he closed his book, lifted his boarding pass with a steady hand, and said, "That's what it says." Captain Remington squinted at the pass, at Samuel, and then back at the seat. He forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well," Remington chuckled, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "I suppose they're letting anyone up here now." The words themselves weren't shouted, but the tone was clear. It wasn't just condescension. It was disbelief. Disdain. Across the aisle, a woman's eyebrows lifted. Her husband, a man in a gray blazer, instinctively lifted his phone and hit record without even thinking about it. Samuel didn't argue. He didn't stiffen. He didn't even flinch. He leaned back in his seat and replied, voice soft but strong, "I believe I earned this seat just like everyone else." Captain Remington smirked, muttered something under his breath, something caught faintly on the phone's recording, "Sure you did." And then he walked on, disappearing into the cockpit. At first, no one said anything. Engines started humming. Safety announcements rolled out mechanically. But the energy in the cabin shifted, subtle but undeniable. It hung in the recycled air between the passengers. Something unspoken had crossed a line. Samuel went back to his book. He read the same paragraph 3 times without realizing it, the words slipping past him like a river he couldn't wade through. Across the aisle, the man with the phone, whose name was Jordan Maddox, whispered to his wife, "I got all of that. Every second." "Should we post it?" she whispered back. He nodded. "People need to see." And so, before the plane even left the gate, the clip was uploaded. What Captain Remington didn't realize, what no one realized, was who Samuel Carter actually was, and just how far this moment would travel. Samuel Carter had spent his life earning the right to sit in any room he chose. And he had done it with a grace that didn't demand attention but commanded it all the same. He was raised in a small house in rural Mississippi, a house his father built with his own hands. Samuel's father, Thomas Carter, worked as a janitor at the local high school but knew more about dignity than anyone with a college degree. He had told young Samuel one thing again and again: don't ever let a man's assumptions about you define your truth. Samuel carried that lesson through every staff meeting, every graduation ceremony, every board review where someone hesitated when they realized the principal was a tall black man in a modest suit, not the assistant, not the custodian. He had nothing to prove, not to anyone, and certainly not to Austin Remington. Halfway to Seattle, the video of that quiet confrontation began to ripple across social media. First 100 views, then 1,000, 10,000. By the time the drink cart rattled down the aisle, Samuel still didn't know that his calm dignity had already captured the world's attention. He sipped his ginger ale, thumbed through his book, and finally managed to read without distraction. Outside, clouds billowed past the windows. Inside, a storm of a different kind brewed. Across the country, people watched the video, shaking their heads in disbelief. The hashtags began. Hashtag Seat2A, hashtag Dignity in Flight, hashtag Samuel Carter. People shared their own stories of subtle slights, assumptions, microaggressions disguised as jokes. Samuel's quiet strength became a rallying point for conversations far larger than one seat on one flight. Meanwhile, Captain Remington, oblivious, flew his route, cracking jokes with his crew, confident as ever. But confidence isn't immunity. By the time Flight 349 touched down at SeaTac, the airline's PR department was in full crisis mode. An internal memo had already gone out. Investigate incident on Flight 349. High priority. Samuel stood, stretched his legs, and adjusted his blazer. As he reached for his carry-on, Jordan Maddox approached. "Sir," he said softly, "before you leave, you should know. Your story is everywhere. The video's gone viral." Samuel paused. He looked at the man, looked at the phone screen glowing with his own calm face, and simply said, "Thank you." No anger, no self-congratulation, just ANOD. Samuel exited into the gate. Applause broke out, not raucous, but real, from a few rows back. Passengers clapped quietly as he walked by. He dipped his head slightly, acknowledging them, and disappeared into the terminal. By the next morning, major news outlets were running the clip. Analysts debated Captain Remington's comments on television. Legal experts weighed in on workplace conduct. Passengers from past flights came forward anonymously, sharing their own uncomfortable encounters with Remington. An anonymous whistleblower, a former flight attendant, described a pattern: jokes made under breath, sidelong comments, assumptions always made about certain passengers who didn't look the part. The airline released a statement: "We are investigating this matter seriously. Respect is fundamental to our values." It was too late. The public wasn't demanding an investigation. They were demanding change. The final blow came 3 days later when Captain Austin Remington was quietly suspended. His email access revoked. His badge deactivated. He wouldn't fly another commercial flight. The airline announced a new initiative, a mandatory training program on implicit bias, named the Carter Standard. Samuel Carter's name was never shouted. It didn't need to be. It lived in the quiet change his presence had demanded. He returned home to Savannah to find a handwritten banner draped across the entrance of his neighborhood. "Welcome home, Mr. Carter. Thank you for standing tall." In his small kitchen, with a worn table and a chipped coffee mug that read, "Best Principal Ever," Samuel sat down, opened his book of Langston Hughes, and smiled. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He had just been a man who refused to move. Because he didn't have to. And because dignity, once claimed, doesn't ask for permission. It just sits still and waits for the world to adjust.